HOA President Karen pointed her gun at my daughter Lily, screaming, "Get out of the pool or I'll kill you." A single shot rang out. Lily screamed, water splashing crimson. Karen smiled, thinking she won. She had no idea who I was, what Karen didn't know. I'm the police chief. She picked the wrong family to terrorize. Before the story unfolds. Comment below which country you're watching from, and subscribe for more unbelievable stories. I remember that day like it was carved into my memory. The kind of day that starts with sunlight, laughter, and the illusion that everything in your world is safe, and ends with a fear so sharp it cuts right through your bones. My daughter Lily was 9 years old, laughing in the pool, splashing water, completely unaware of the storm that had been gathering just across the street. Her small hands paddled furiously, sending droplets glittering through the air, her tiny voice piercing the lazy suburban calm with innocent joy. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to relax, to watch her play without thinking about the tension simmering just beyond the fence. My wife Emma was nearby, smiling softly, watching Lily, arranging snacks and drinks, her own laughter soft and warm. The sunlight hit her hair just right, and I realized I had never felt more at peace, yet I didn't know how fragile that peace really was. Karen had been our neighbor for years, but recently, something in her had shifted. She had always been loud, controlling, self-important, the kind of person who made you feel guilty just for existing. She prided herself on her HOA title, using it as a weapon to enforce her sense of control over every blade of grass, every mailbox, every child in the neighborhood. Her complaints had started small, almost laughably trivial. Our mailbox wasn't the exact shade she had decreed. The pool cover wasn't folded to her liking. Lily's toys left on the driveway were obscene in her eyes. At first I laughed. I thought it was minor, ridiculous, the kind of thing that would fade. But Karen didn't operate like normal people. She thrived on control, intimidation, and the illusion of absolute authority. Weeks turned into months, and her behavior escalated. Threatening letters arrived, notes slipped under the door, calls to the HOA with fabricated grievances. Her stares became more frequent, more menacing, a silent assertion that she owned the street, that happiness in our house was her business to regulate. I tried reasoning with her, tried to explain that children have the right to play, families deserve their homes, that rules were meant to protect, not punish. She didn't care. She wanted power, dominance, a daily reminder that she could make our lives miserable. I spent years enforcing the law, putting criminals behind bars, mediating conflicts, saving lives. I'd faced dangerous men with guns, reckless criminals, threats in the dead of night. But nothing in all my years had prepared me for a neighbor who looked at your family and saw targets, who believed that her status gave her the right to harm the innocent. Karen was meticulous, calculating, patient. Every complaint, every glare, every whispered warning to the HOA board was part of a plan, a slow build-up to the day she thought she could break us. That morning, Lily's laughter floated across the backyard, the sun glinting off the pool, the water shimmering like diamonds. For a moment, I let myself relax, thinking maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't act today. The false security wrapped around me like a blanket, but deep in my gut, I felt it, the tension, the unease, that quiet sense that something was wrong. Karen had been planning for weeks. I could feel it, though I didn't yet understand the depth of her obsession, the cruelty she had nurtured. Her attacks had started subtly. Standing at her window, she'd glare at Lily, her lips pressing into a thin line as if she was measuring every breath, every splash. She would mutter threats under her breath while trimming her rose bushes, words laced with venom that sounded harmless at first, but they carried a promise, a warning. Her husband, a silent enabler, nodded along without protest, his presence reinforcing her twisted sense of power. The neighborhood whispered about her behavior, but most people avoided confrontation, unwilling to step into the chaos she cultivated. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. I tried to tell myself she wouldn't cross the line, but every instinct I had screamed otherwise. There was a darkness in her, a hunger for control that had no end, no moral boundaries, and she had chosen my family as her next target. I couldn't see it yet, couldn't imagine the level of cruelty she had prepared. But the signs were there, the intensity of her stare, the tension in her shoulders when she passed by, the silent calculation of her movements. I sipped my coffee, feeling the weight in my chest. I watched Lily float in the water, her tiny face radiant with happiness. Emma arranged the towels nearby, her hands steady, her mind free of worry, unaware that Karen had already decided that our family's joy would not go unchallenged. The calm before the storm was deceptive. The sunlight, the laughter, the suburban peace, it was fragile, hanging by a thread. Karen was sharpening her claws, and soon there would be no warning, no escape, no way to protect the life I cherished above all else. That day, I learned that some monsters don't hide in the shadows. They live next door behind HOA titles and polite smiles. They wait for moments of happiness to destroy them, and when they strike, they do so with precision, cruelty, and total disregard for innocence. And at that moment I had no idea that Karen had already made her move. That the storm I had feared was not coming. It had already arrived. Hidden behind a perfectly manicured lawn, a forced smile, and eyes that saw my daughter not as a child, but as a target, I still hear that first scream in my nightmares. Sharper than any gunshot I had ever heard in my life. It was Lily, my little girl, her voice high and panicked, slicing through the air like glass breaking in slow motion. I didn't know what was happening at first, just the sudden, bone-chilling sound, a sound that immediately made every instinct in my body flare to life. Then I saw her, Karen, my neighbor, my so-called HOA president, the person I had tried to reason with, the person I thought, in some impossible way, had limits. She didn't, she had none. That twisted smile of hers was still there, but it had changed into something darker, something that had no place in any world where innocence was meant to survive. And in her hands, was a gun. A cold, metallic extension of her rage and madness aimed directly at my daughter. I ran, faster than I thought my body could move, but even as I reached her, Karen had already pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot echoed across the neighborhood, a single deafening sound that tore through the sunny afternoon, shattering everything in its path. Water splashed everywhere. Lily fell backward, the pool turning red around her, the ripples spreading like fire through what had been the calmest, happiest corner of my world. My chest felt like it had been ripped open, every heartbeat a hammer of panic and fury. I screamed her name, the sound raw and ragged, tearing through my throat, but for a moment it felt as if the world had stopped. Time had frozen in that sickening split second when evil revealed itself fully, unmistakably. Neighbors were everywhere, screaming, phones raised in disbelief. But nobody moved fast enough. Nobody knew what to do. They couldn't see the magnitude of what was happening because they didn't understand who Karen had just attacked or who was about to respond. My training kicked in, but it was almost irrelevant, almost meaningless. Because this wasn't a crime scene I could investigate calmly. This was my daughter, my blood, my family in immediate danger. And the person responsible was standing there smiling, thinking she had won. The fire of anger consumed me. Hotter than any gunshot wound I'd ever treated. Hotter than any criminal's threat I had ever faced. Karen had overstepped every conceivable boundary. She had crossed the line from ridiculous petty HOA complaints into actual violence, targeting a child because she had no power over her in the pool. She didn't see Lily as a child. She saw her as a symbol of disobedience, of resistance to Karen's rule, and she had decided that no one could defy her. No one could laugh in her neighborhood. No one could exist in her perfect little world. And she was going to make sure of it. I can still remember the smell, that acrid tang of gunpowder mixed with chlorine, the metallic scent that seared itself into my brain, every inhalation a reminder of what had just happened. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached Lily, but I forced myself to stay focused. I didn't care about decorum, I didn't care about neighbors, I didn't care about rules. There was only one thing that mattered, getting my daughter out of harm's way and making sure that Karen never thought she could do this again. My training, my years as police chief, my knowledge of threats and violence, they all came flooding back in that moment. Not as a badge, not as authority, but as a weapon. A tool to protect the most important thing in my life. Karen, of course, had no fear. That woman had never known fear in her life. She pointed the gun at me next, her face twisted into a smirk. Thinking she could intimidate me because I had obeyed rules, because I had tried to be patient, because I had let her bully me and my family without retaliation. She had no idea that patience had a limit, that the law had limits, but the fury of a father protecting his child had no bounds. I stepped forward, voice loud and unflinching, heart hammering in my chest, and every neighbor finally realized this wasn't a simple dispute. This was a war, and I was fully awake. Lily was crying, small and terrified, her body trembling as I held her close, but she was alive. The water around her swirled with the evidence of Karen's madness, a stark reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. And then it hit me. Karen didn't know. She didn't know that the father she was challenging was the police chief. She didn't know the kind of training, the kind of authority, the kind of resources I could unleash in moments like this. And that, more than anything, made her mistake catastrophic. The neighbors backed away instinctively, unsure whether to call the police or run, but it didn't matter. I didn't wait. I approached Karen with a calm so dangerous it should have terrified her, my voice steady but icy. "Karen," I said, and even through the chaos, even with the adrenaline pounding in my ears, she heard the authority in my tone. She had no idea that she had just awakened the full force of the law in human form, a man who would never forgive her for threatening the life of his daughter. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, a line that would ensure she would never again have power over my family. And as she realized her mistake, the color drained from her face, replaced by panic, desperation, and the dawning realization that her petty games had ended in true violence. She had learned too late that she had chosen the wrong family, the wrong neighborhood, the wrong father to terrorize. The chaos didn't end immediately. Screams, shouts, and the ringing in my ears all collided into one impossible moment, a storm of sound and fear. But in the center of it, I held Lily, and the world narrowed to the knowledge that she was safe, and Karen would pay for every second of terror she had caused. That was the only thing I knew for certain. The attack had been made. The lesson would be enforced, and no HOA title, no arrogance, no false sense of power would protect her from the consequences of what she had done. From that moment on, nothing was the same. Karen had revealed her true nature, her madness, and my daughter had survived. But the story wasn't over. Oh no, it had only just begun, and every heartbeat after that was a countdown to the justice that she would never see coming. The moment passed, but the shock had barely settled, and a fire erupted inside me that I could not control. I held Lily in my arms, trembling, her little body shivering with fear and pain, and I realized something that made my blood run ice cold. Karen didn't just threaten my daughter. She had targeted her because she knew she could, because she thought she owned the street, because she believed no one would stop her. And that belief, that arrogance, that delusion, it was the kind of thing that made people like her dangerous, unstoppable if left unchecked. In that moment, the realization hit me harder than any weapon ever could. This was not an accident. This was intentional. Every complaint, every glare, every petty conflict, every note shoved under my door, every complaint filed with the HOA had been preparation. She had been building toward this, waiting for a day when she could strike without fear of consequences, and today she had tried to take my daughter from me, figuratively and almost literally, with her own two hands. I can still feel the way my chest tightened, the rage like molten fire inside me, spreading through my veins until every thought, every heartbeat, every fiber of my being was consumed with one undeniable truth. Karen would pay for this. There was no debate, no question, no room for mercy. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had violated a boundary so fundamental that I could not allow her to remain unpunished. And yet, even as fury surged, a calm clarity took hold. I was not just a father in this moment. I was the police chief. Every decision I made, every move I took, was backed by authority, law, and the power to ensure that what Karen had done could never happen again. The realization was intoxicating, the combination of personal vendetta and professional authority giving me a sense of purpose I had never felt so sharply before. It was then that I noticed the faces around me, neighbors frozen in shock, whispers and murmurs filling the air, unsure whether to help, run, or record. Most of them had spent years tolerating Karen's madness, pretending it wasn't there, or quietly hoping it would pass. But none of them understood what it meant to challenge me, to attack my family, to assume that the law would not respond with full force. They didn't know I carried the badge not just as a job, but as a promise that anyone who threatened my family would face consequences so immediate, so uncompromising that they would regret ever opening their mouth, ever standing in my way. Karen, of course, had begun to realize her mistake. The smirk she had worn like armor now faltered, the confidence she had carried like a shield cracking under pressure. I could see it in her eyes, The first glimmer of panic, that tiny human flicker of fear she had never experienced in her life. But her arrogance was thick, stubborn, like concrete filling the space where common sense should have been. She still believed she could charm, manipulate, or intimidate, unaware that every second she lingered was sealing her fate. My rage, once wild and untamed, was now methodical, precise. I wasn't just angry. I was calculated, aware of every tool at my disposal, every resource I could unleash to ensure justice. The moments stretched, tension hanging like a lead weight, until I finally spoke, my voice cold and sharp, cutting through the panic. "Karen," I said, and she flinched at the authority in my tone. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, to plead, to scream, but no words came. None could. She realized belatedly that she had miscalculated. She had taken on the wrong family, the wrong father, the wrong law enforcement officer. And as that realization sank in, rage boiled even hotter inside me, not just at her actions, but at the months of build-up, the psychological warfare, the quiet terror she had inflicted, thinking she could get away with it. I held Lily close, her small hands gripping mine, her fear palpable, and I made a promise in that instant that no title, no badge, no HOA position would protect Karen from what was coming. This was personal, yes, but it was also professional. I had the authority to act, the means to ensure she would never terrorize another family, and the clarity of mind to use it fully. Every beat of my heart, every breath, every drop of adrenaline screamed that she would pay, that she would see consequences she had never imagined, that she had just unleashed a storm she could not survive. And in that heat, in that mingling of fear, fury, and authority, I realized the depth of what Karen had done. She had underestimated me in every way possible. She thought she could threaten a child, intimidate a father, and remain untouchable. She had no idea that I was capable of seeing through her, anticipating her moves, and retaliating with the full weight of law and life experience. That was the moment I knew everything had changed. Karen wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was a target, and I was ready. From that point onward, nothing would ever be the same. I had seen the face of true arrogance and cruelty, and I had felt the spike of fear in my daughter. That fear fueled me, sharpened my mind, and ignited a sense of justice that was personal, relentless, and unyielding. Karen had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had challenged the wrong family, the wrong father, the wrong police chief. And the realization of that fact, cold, sharp, and undeniable, set the stage for the reckoning she would never forget. Once the initial shock passed, a calm clarity took over, the kind that only comes when every instinct, every ounce of experience, and every shred of authority converges into a single purpose. I held Lily close, her small trembling body pressed against mine, and realized that this was no longer just a family crisis. This was a test, one I intended to pass on my terms. Karen had believed that fear and arrogance could shield her from consequences, but she had gravely underestimated the kind of justice a father, a police chief, could deliver. And I was about to show her the difference between petty power and true authority. My mind raced through every option, every law, every procedure I had learned over decades of service, but this was personal, raw, and immediate. I didn't need paperwork, I didn't need permission, and I didn't need approval. The law was on my side, and my daughter's safety demanded action now. I spoke firmly, commanding the attention of the neighborhood and of Karen herself. Every word, every syllable carried the weight of authority, the kind of voice that had sent criminals running and resolved chaos countless times. "Karen," I said, voice cold and unwavering, "you have crossed a line that can never be crossed. Your actions are criminal and you will face the consequences. You have no idea who you are dealing with." Her face, which had once radiated smugness and control, now contorted into confusion and fear. She hadn't anticipated the fury of someone who had been trained, tested, and hardened by years of enforcing law and order. She had assumed that her HOA title, her arrogant sense of superiority, and her previous manipulations would shield her from any real retaliation. She had assumed incorrectly. Every second she hesitated, every micro-expression of panic that crossed her face, reinforced what I already knew. Karen was unprepared for the reality of a father's wrath combined with the power of law. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, sharpening my focus, heightening every sense, every thought. I moved with precision, calculating each step as if the entire situation were a chessboard, and I had already foreseen every move she could make. The neighbors, who had frozen in fear just moments ago, now recognized the authority in my stance, the weight of command that I carried effortlessly. Murmurs spread through the yards, whispers of disbelief, whispers of awe. No one had ever seen Karen confronted like this, stripped of her armor of arrogance, and made to face the magnitude of her misjudgment. And then it happened. The moment where preparation, instinct, and authority collided. I called for immediate law enforcement backup, but I didn't wait for them to arrive before taking control. I was the chief. This was my jurisdiction, and Karen had made the fatal error of believing that her status as HOA president meant she could act above the law. I ensured Lily was safe first, shielding her, calming her, while simultaneously directing neighbors to keep their distance and secure the perimeter. Every command was precise, every instruction given with the gravity of someone who had trained for moments like this. Yet this time it was not a drill. It was life and death, and justice demanded immediate execution. Karen's panic became visible, her confidence crumbling like a house of cards in a storm. She fumbled with excuses, muttered half-hearted threats, and tried to rationalize her actions, but reason had no place here. Her power was a fragile illusion, a veneer over the truth. She had attacked a child, and she was now exposed for exactly what she was, a coward hiding behind titles and authority that meant nothing against someone who could enforce real justice. Every movement she made, every breath she took underscored her desperation. And I recognized it instantly, the exact moment her control shattered, replaced by terror she had never experienced before. I was deliberate. I didn't rush, I didn't panic. I was methodical, authoritative, and terrifyingly calm. Karen needed to understand the full scope of her miscalculation. Her attempts to deflect responsibility failed under the weight of my presence and the truth of what she had done. And as I stood there, enforcing the law in its purest form, I felt the satisfaction of a long-fought battle coming into focus. This was not vengeance. This was justice. Every letter she had written, every petty complaint, every moment of intimidation had led to this reckoning. And now she would experience consequences she had never imagined, in the stark reality of a father who would stop at nothing to protect his child. Time seemed to stretch, moments ticking like hours until finally backup arrived. Even then, I remained in control, orchestrating the response with precision, ensuring that Karen was restrained, ensuring that Lily's safety was guaranteed, and ensuring that the lesson she had tried to teach us, that fear and power could control us, was turned completely on its head. Karen had been exposed for the coward she truly was, and the full weight of law, authority, and familial protection bore down upon her. By the time the situation was fully contained, Karen had learned a truth she would never forget. Power that is built on cruelty and arrogance is fragile, fleeting and always vulnerable to the force of someone who values family above all else. Justice had been served, not as vengeance, not as spectacle, but as the undeniable response of a father and a police chief combined, an unrelenting force that could not be ignored, circumvented, or intimidated. The realization hit me then, as I held Lily close, her body trembling but alive. Karen had crossed the line, and the consequences would ripple far beyond this day, far beyond this neighborhood. She had no idea the storm she had unleashed, and she had no idea the full force of what she had provoked. Every fiber of her being had underestimated me, underestimated the depth of my resolve, and underestimated the law itself when applied by someone who would protect what mattered most at all costs. The moments after the attack stretched endlessly, a tense haze where disbelief collided with relief, and every heartbeat reminded me of how close we had come to losing everything. Lily was alive, though trembling, her small hands clutching mine, and I realized with a cold clarity that nothing in our neighborhood or our lives would ever be the same again. Karen, once the confident, imperious HOA president who had dictated petty rules and terrorized neighbors with impunity, now stood exposed, her arrogance stripped bare, replaced with panic, confusion, and a dawning understanding of the consequences she had never anticipated. She had no idea that attacking my family would ignite a chain reaction she could not control, that every lie, every complaint, every intimidation tactic she had used for months would finally catch up to her. Neighbors gathered, still whispering, phones pressed to their ears, some calling authorities, some recording what had happened, but most standing frozen, staring at the unraveling spectacle of Karen's humiliation. For months, they had tolerated her tyranny, her constant meddling, her relentless pursuit of control over everyone's lives. But now they were witnessing the real cost of her arrogance. Karen had miscalculated. She had assumed that her HOA title, her neighborhood influence, and her false sense of authority could protect her from real consequences. She had assumed wrong. I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, a fear she had never known in her carefully controlled world. She had treated our lives as if they were hers to manipulate, our happiness as if it were something to punish. But the moment she crossed the line, tried to harm Lily, her illusions shattered. She had no plan for facing someone who combined professional authority with personal fury. Every action she had taken, every petty complaint, every whispered insult, every attempt at intimidation, all of it culminated in this reckoning, and she had no escape. I felt a complex mixture of relief and fury as the authorities finally arrived to formally intervene. Backup officers, unaware of my personal stake but trained to respect command, moved in under my direction, containing Karen before she could flee or escalate further. Even in her panic, she tried to argue, to deflect, to justify her actions, but no words could undo the truth. She had attacked a child, she had threatened a family, and the consequences were immediate and undeniable. I realized then that all the months of tension, all the whispered threats, all the subtle manipulations had been leading to this moment. Every neighbor who had watched silently, hoping for civility or fearing confrontation, now saw exactly what unchecked arrogance and cruelty could produce. As I held Lily, soothing her, whispering reassurances, I could feel her fear slowly ebbing, replaced by a fragile sense of safety. She didn't understand the full scope of what had happened, but she could feel my presence, my control, my unwavering commitment to protect her. And in that commitment, I found a renewed sense of purpose. Karen had sought to dominate, to intimidate, to instill fear, but in doing so, she had revealed her weakness. Her power had always been a facade, a brittle veneer that crumbled the moment it faced true authority combined with love, with protection, with the relentless force of someone who would never allow harm to come to their child. The fallout rippled beyond our backyard. The neighborhood, which had once whispered about Karen's petty tyranny and fear, now whispered about her fear, about her failure, about the moment when her control was irrevocably broken. Conversations shifted. Eyes that once averted her gaze now studied her every move, measuring the cracks in the armor she had so carefully maintained. The HOA board, which had enabled her for so long, could no longer ignore what had happened. Complaints, investigations, and formal actions began almost immediately. Karen's reputation, once untouchable in her own mind, was dismantled in hours, a collapse as total as it was inevitable. Even as legal processes began, even as the neighborhood began to process the shock, I understood something crucial. This wasn't just about justice for Lily. It was about exposing a truth that had long been hidden. Karen had thrived on fear because no one dared to confront her. She had attacked my daughter because she believed she could. She had misjudged who she was dealing with. And the moment she realized that mistake, the ripple of consequences spread like wildfire. Authority. Real authority, the kind that combines law, skill, and personal commitment, cannot be ignored, cannot be manipulated, and cannot be intimidated. I looked at my daughter and saw in her eyes a mixture of fear and awe. She had faced something terrifying, something completely outside her understanding, and yet she survived. And I realized that the act of protection, of enforcing boundaries, of confronting evil, had shown her a lesson no one else could teach. Karen had underestimated the depths of a parent's love, the reach of a father's commitment, and the power of someone who is not just willing but determined to act when the safety of their child is at stake. Karen's downfall was swift. Her HOA privileges were suspended, her threats recorded, and her credibility demolished. No longer could she walk the streets with impunity. No longer could she manipulate, intimidate, or terrorize without consequence. She had crossed the line, and now every neighbor, every observer, every voice in that community understood the price of arrogance unchecked by law, compassion, or morality. The fallout was complete. The lesson was clear. And even as the sun set over the neighborhood, painting everything in hues of orange and red, I held Lily tighter, promising myself that nothing and no one would ever threaten her again. Karen had made her move. She had revealed her nature, and she had learned the hard way that the wrong family, the wrong father, the wrong police chief, could not be intimidated, could not be manipulated, and would never, Ever stand by when a child was in danger? The ripple of justice had begun, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were surreal, a haze of disbelief, triumph, and exhaustion that clung to every moment like a second skin. I held Lily close each night, still amazed that she had survived the cruelty of Karen's unchecked madness. And yet I could feel the lingering tension in her small body, the residue of fear that takes longer to heal than any visible injury. The neighborhood, once silent witnesses to Karen's petty tyranny, now whispered a different story, one of awe, judgment, and finally understanding. They saw in slow dawning realization that authority, when wielded with precision and love, could dismantle the illusions of power that monsters like Karen cling to so desperately. Even now, I could feel the weight of what had happened. Karen had tried to dominate, intimidate, and inflict harm, but she had underestimated the depth of a father's fury, the reach of someone who combines personal devotion with professional authority. She thought her HOA title made her untouchable, her arrogance a shield against consequences. She had been catastrophically wrong. That was the bitter truth she would carry forever, and in that knowledge I found a grim satisfaction. Justice had been served not as spectacle, but as inevitability. The culmination of months of tension, of manipulation, of relentless cruelty, finally meeting the unyielding force of someone unwilling to allow harm to touch their child. In those days, I began to notice the subtle shifts around the neighborhood. Faces that had once avoided me in fear or complacency now registered respect, understanding, and even relief. People realized what it meant to confront a bully like Karen, what it meant to challenge someone who abuses the illusion of authority. The whispers about HOA rules, petty fines, and unnecessary complaints faded into insignificance compared to the overwhelming lesson that true authority is rooted in protection, in justice, and in unbreakable resolve. Karen had taught everyone a lesson she could not undo, and though her arrogance would have tried to shield her, it had failed. Completely, utterly, permanently. And yet, even as I watched the fallout unfold, I felt the persistent pulse of vigilance in my chest. This was not over, not entirely. Karen would never admit fault, would never comprehend the enormity of what she had done, and would likely continue to believe somewhere in the recesses of her mind that she could manipulate or intimidate others. But I knew her limitations now, her fragility, the way fear had finally cracked the carefully constructed armor she had wrapped around herself for years. Every email, every complaint, every petty attempt to control the neighborhood would now be measured against the stark reality. She had attacked a child, faced the full response of law and authority, and survived only to lose everything she thought she owned. For Lily, the days were a mix of normal childhood and cautious vigilance. She laughed again, though more quietly at first, and I encouraged every ounce of joy, knowing that it was her right, her inheritance, and the very thing Karen had tried to strip away. I watched her grow stronger in subtle ways, confidence in her movements, a newfound bravery in her smile, a willingness to stand up for herself in ways that mirrored my own resolve. She had faced the unimaginable, survived it, and emerged with a spark that would never be extinguished. And I, as both father and protector, felt the weight of responsibility intensify. Karen had reminded me, in the cruelest fashion, that vigilance was not optional. Protection was not temporary. Authority, when combined with love, was both shield and sword, and I had wielded it to perfection. Karen's downfall was complete, yet I could not ignore the lingering echoes of her presence. Even confined by law and stripped of HOA power, she remained a shadow over the neighborhood, a reminder of the length some people will go to impose their will. And while justice had been served in its most immediate form, the lesson extended beyond punishment. It was a demonstration, a living warning to everyone who thought cruelty, intimidation, or arrogance could go unchallenged. Authority, courage, and love intersect in moments like these, and when they do, they become unstoppable. Karen had tested this truth, and the results were irreversible. As I reflected on the chaos, the fear, and the triumph, I realized something profound. The story was not just about a neighbor gone rogue, a bullet fired, or a father's fury unleashed. It was about the resilience of innocence, the power of protection, and the necessity of action when those we love are threatened. It was about showing a monster the limits of her control and ensuring that the next generation, my daughter, my family, would grow in a world where tyranny meets consequences. Karen had been defeated, yes, But the victory was not merely hers to lose. It belonged to Lily, to our family, and to every neighbor who now understood that courage and authority are not optional. They are essential. And in the quiet moments, when the adrenaline ebbed and the fear receded, I held Lily in my arms and whispered promises that went beyond words. Promises of protection, of unwavering vigilance, and of love so fierce that no threat, no matter how brazen, could ever touch her again. Karen had been exposed. Justice had moved. The lesson was eternal. And as the neighborhood slowly returned to its semblance of calm, I knew with unshakable certainty that nothing and no one would ever threaten my daughter again.